Okay, so for the month of April, the big AAA standard game for the Rift is Wilson's Heart, one that I personally had been looking forward to a lot. I've said it before, I like horrors, but if there's one thing I like more than horrors, it's thrillers, because I'd rather be thrilled than horrified. Thriller is a bit vague. I like me some psychological thrillers, the kind that make you think, and that's not a terrible descriptor for Wilson's Heart. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the first word that the devs would use to describe it. It's a tricky one, because thematically and tonally, Wilson's Heart can at times be a bit of a mess, and at other times seem to know exactly what it's going for. But for all intents and purposes, let's just say that it's 2 parts film noir, 5 parts monster madness, and a sprinkling of H.P. Lovecraft. That's a good recipe. But was it overcooked? Was the picture on the menu nothing like what we were served? Let's start with the premise. I'll quickly throw out here that I'm really trying to avoid spoilers with the footage because it's a game about mystery and keeping you guessing. So just focus on my soft, but hard, tender loving voice and try to ignore the fact that I'm ill. You're Wilson and you wake up in a hospital where everything has gone weird. People are dying, there's all manner of supernatural threat, you're not sure if you can trust anyone, and all you've got on your side is your magic mechanical heart and an awesome gravelly voice.
Operator, how may I direct your call?
I'm a patient here in the hospital. Look, something is wrong. I'm not sure what is going on, but
It's you. I'm sorry, sir. I'm going to need you to clear the line.
What?
I said clear the line.
You have to teleport to different spots of each room or hallway that the game decided you're allowed to approach. Figure out why that's the case, be it fiddling with a switch or picking up an item to use elsewhere, and occasionally finding pages of a mystery book that hopefully holds the secrets to what's happened.
Why would you hide this?
The node teleport system is something I thought I'd dislike more than I did, but I think it gels pretty well with the overall cinematic gloss on the game. Whilst it does clearly restrict a lot of what can happen, and how the series of basic physical problems that make up the vast majority of the gameplay are handled, it still works a lot better than a free teleport system would have because it allows for more scripted events. The fact that you can see Wilson's pose is also nice as it allows you to go into each node knowing what direction you'll be looking, and even see subtle cues from Wilson's body language that help you feel more connected to the protagonist and more quickly develops his character. That said, Wilson's motivations and opinions are all fairly straightforward. He's basically a good bloke, whose bravery seems to stem from the fact that he finds all this paranormal stuff more of an inconvenience than anything else. He just wants his heart back. So you slowly teleport around looking for things and trying to open doors, interacting with what has got to be the most consistent, in-depth touch control setup in any game to date. The amount of objects to interact with is really good.
Is anybody there?
And the motions required to perform actions are generally obvious and intuitive, as long as you know how things like tools and lockpicks would work in the most basic sense. In my play space of 2 by 1.5 meters, I did sometimes run into the boundary, which was weird given the kind of action, but it is very easy to recalibrate, and I only had the barrier ruin the tension maybe once. All of this places Wilson's Heart as something that anyone can play, and it's not just a tech demo. It's a damn good attempt at placing you in a world and letting you do your thing. It is restrictive, and sometimes you'll know what you've got to do not so much because you figured it out, but because you had so few options and places you could teleport to. But when you keep in mind the overall cinematic style, and the fact that this isn't supposed to be a horror game or a hardcore puzzle game, but rather a narrative experience, you can forgive some of the concessions it's made. And as a narrative experience, Wilson's Heart is really up there. And not just for games in VR. We all know you can get more easily immersed with the monitor attached to your face, but the world and the characters around you really do ooze polish. So there's no jank in the tasks that you're asked to do, but more importantly, again considering this is a sort of a movie, the voice acting is generally top notch, the modelling and animation is great, and aside from maybe a few faces that look like they've had a cheeky bit of Botox at times, there's very little to take you out of the experience. An obvious comparison for me would be LA Noire, which had you judge realistic facial expressions to find out who had done bad things.
They was working on the tires. That's all that was took.
And I'd say that Wilson's Heart has the same attention to detail when it comes to facial expressions and voice acting that puts it a cut above the standard AAA title. Another thing that really helps the movie feel is the fact that loading screens are pretty much non-existent. Sometimes the screen will be black for a moment, but it's generally seamless. The characters in Wilson's Heart all have their own distinct personalities and agendas. Not everyone is who you think they are, and there's loads of tropes in there from the kind of media that inspired the game. In fact, If you're a connoisseur and pay close attention, then you'll probably guess a few things and have a few gleeful moments when you realise you've caught something earlier than some others might have. Wilson's Heart really doesn't hide its inspiration either. You've got movie posters on the walls, and in addition to learning about the world you've been dropped into through newspapers, there's a shitload of comics of various styles that you'll quickly realise are more than just set dressing, and they even include some cute nods to their inspiration. If you're not reading everything you can, then you're doing it wrong. Thankfully then, it's not too hard to read most things. A common problem with these low resolution VR headsets that you just don't get the kind of visual fidelity needed to have things like handwriting in the actual size they would be in the real world. But aside from one instance where they chose to put cursive writing in a journal, I was able to read what I had to read with relatively small amounts of squinting and angling the books in a fashion that probably took years off the longevity of my wrist joints. Whilst there is a lot of good to say about how polished the world is, there's also quite a lot wrong with Wilson's Heart. The pacing of the story is pretty good. Really, you're just moving along, learning about everything slowly. But unfortunately, in addition to the genuinely enjoyable problem solving with keys and crowbars and all that jazz, you also have puzzle fights. So, at a few points in the game you'll be thrust into a fight, usually involving 3 repetitions of you hitting a baddie. And to get to that stage you'll have to solve the problem of how you defend yourself. Now, these fights are definitely accessible to everyone. Whether you own a pair of gunners because you're so keen, or you're letting your non-gamer friends have a good time in your VR. There's no requirement for good reflexes or anything like that. When you apply this to combat, it tends to feel a bit patronising. It's not hard, and it's not very satisfying, and it often feels artificially padded out. Minor spoilers incoming. The fact that enemies do things like jump at a wall and then off the wall for star points and then lift up their hands and slowly bring them down on you is weird. It's as if their plan was to slowly crush you like that hydraulic press channel, rather than hit you with their meaty arms like a blunt instrument. Never mind the fact that they could have just leapt at you. I'm sure that without the fights the pacing would also have suffered because it would have just been too quick and lacked variance. You'd lose your group and then quickly get them back and it wouldn't feel like anything much could have happened in that time. But it really feels like an executive walked in and said, "Hey, yeah, all this talking stuff, it's great. It's really great. Paranormal, right? But what if we made them fight a big frog man? You know, like the creature from the Black Lagoon." It just doesn't really feel to me like it gels with the things the game does well. Now, maybe a third of the fight/action sequences are really enjoyable, and the others aren't awful, but they're just not really good. I wish they'd designed some more puzzles instead or made the story a bit more intricate, because it's not by any means a complex whodunit. It's a pretty straightforward line to the end, and it doesn't really ask anything of you other than your attention. While the puzzles were a bit hit and miss, some of them had some really cool solutions, so I would have liked to see some more. Another problem I found with the story was the way that some things just went. Again, not really a spoiler, but for a while you've got messages in newspapers and little manual pages all saying things to you. You've got this theme of the dark coming to get you and you're being taunted, and something out there is pretty convinced you're totally boned. And a lot of the gameplay is centered around that, and then it kind of just goes around the same time you really start to uncover things. That was a bit weird. Almost like the threat of the dark was just there to keep you engaged until the next threat, and so on. Rather than any real overarching theme, it's more of a throw lots at you and see what sticks, and it does make it all feel a bit superficial. When paired with the combat, it really makes me wonder if they knew exactly who their audience was, and spread the game a bit too thin trying to appeal to everyone. There's also the fact that there's a bunch of pretty grim stuff that might catch someone out who's really squeamish, but it all kind of fell flat as far as resonating with me. There was a kind of matter-of-factedness when it came to seeing corpses and big bads that isn't really against the theme because old movies aren't scary by today's standards, and that's basically what this game is. It just comes across as fairly interesting and even a bit funny at times, but it does make the fight sequences with monsters that could be scary just feel a bit unnecessary. I really don't see what the point is in fighting something that can kill you in a single blow if it gets you, but elicits no emotional response because of the way it was framed. It just puts you in a weird spot where you're a bit too disconnected with the action. And then you get back to the dialogue and your heart's back in it because you've been drip fed a bit more of what's going on, either through words or implications. I found myself gesturing along with Wilson because I knew how he'd respond and had these awesome looking arms.
Where are they?
I came here with my father, but he died.
I'm sorry, Lucy.
I also did some other things that I'm not proud of.
We still need the rest before I can do much with it. I was hoping to find out if anyone is reporting about what's happening here. Daring to hope for a rescue, I'm afraid.
Antenna is broken.
It's worth saying that the music in Wilson's Heart is really good. It's actually something they throw out there on their website, right out in the open, that the guy who did the music, Christopher Young, had some other pretty big gigs. And if you ask me, he was bang on with capturing the different styles and tones and instruments that you want to hear from this genre. I can't remember the music in any of the fights though. It's really just those subtle few notes of intrigue here and there, and the general paranormal ensemble that stood out. Again, on the sound side, the 3D sound was really good with a few exceptions, namely again in the swamp creature fight, the direction that the baddies were coming from seemed at times to be behind me. That fight is a really good example of pretty much everything that wasn't good about Wilson's Heart. Another thing was the occasional lack of logic in the puzzles. So in one case I died because I electrified a pool just before all of the little monsters came out. That felt pretty stupid because if they were in there they should have died anyway. A better example of the lack of logic impacting the storytelling and puzzle side of things in a negative way was when I couldn't go into a kitchen to even see what was there because I first had to open another room and get a flask. Because there's things in the kitchen that you want to put in the flask. They could have just made it so that I couldn't pick those things up until the context was there for me to do so, which would have made sense. Instead, I just couldn't go into this kitchen. It's worth saying that the kitchen didn't have a door or anything. I just didn't have any nodes that I could teleport to. That was a bit silly. But really, the fight sequences are, by a huge margin, the big offenders when it comes to breaking immersion. Why does this one enemy have unlimited butcher knives in his pockets? And why do grenades blast someone around the room intact when exploding at their feet, but turn them into giblets when exploding on their back? These things stick out like a sore thumb. The Serious Sam games made a good case for not needing VR from the ground up games so much, but rather just being able to play any first person game in VR. Honestly, the movement and lack of sickness and just downright fun that I've had with those old games but in VR was quite illuminating for me. However, there are and should be games that are designed to really focus on the different control style that the Rift and Vive offer. And Wilson's Heart is a really good case for why we need both types of games. It does things that mean it wouldn't be nearly as good with a keyboard and mouse. Even if you could walk up to and press A to pull the lever, there's absolutely something gained from carrying out the action yourself, especially in a slow-paced game. Rather than being a gimmick, the interaction with this world felt genuine, and plants you firmly in the shoes of a good character who has to solve some problems to figure out what the hell is going on. Overall, I definitely rate Wilson's Heart highly. I love that it exists, and I really want to point out how nice the themes have been from a bunch of these Oculus specific games. There's Edge of Nowhere and Wilson's Heart for games that tell a horror story without relying on jump scares. Instead, just bringing in some classic paranormal storytelling, a style that I really love. Then there's Chronos, which mechanically is a blend of Dark Souls and Zelda, but managed to create its own world and its own feel from the colour palette, the stylistic choices and camera angles, and its simple but important aging mechanic. It's really good stuff, and it makes me happy I bought a Rift, basically, though I would be reviving the shit out of it if I didn't. For all its flaws, I'd say that given the current spread of AAA games, that Wilson's Heart is a must-buy for anyone who isn't flat out broke or doesn't appreciate a good old story. It's not that long, coming in at just over 5 hours for me, but even if I didn't get the game for free, you heard me, I'm a big deal. I wouldn't feel too hard done by with the asking price. I'll certainly be getting some loved ones on this one, as I think it's really one to share. If you have doubts, I'd maybe wait for a sale, but I think this is a must buy for any Rift owner. It's going to be a tough one for Lone Echo to beat, I think. That's all. I'll have more videos coming out soon, so make sure that you're subscribed. If you've played Wilson's Heart, let me know what you thought of it. If not, comment something else, otherwise it's like you're stealing my video. Not really. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time.